February 28th, Israel and the US launched a massive, full-scale strike on Iran. In under 12 hours, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei was killed. The IRGC's high command was virtually wiped out. Iranians flooded the streets to celebrate. Over 2,000 critical targets have been destroyed. Israel is now expanding the war, bombing Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Trump vowed revenge for 3 fallen US soldiers, declaring strikes will continue for 4 weeks until the regime totally collapses. Following Khamenei's death, Iran fell into sheer hysteria. They fired missiles at 8 neighboring countries, including Oman, their neutral mediator. Most were intercepted, but the targeted nations may now join the fight. The war is escalating. This conflict has already dwarfed last June's 12-day war. From the start, the goal was regime change. Trump directly urged the Iranian people to overthrow the government and take back their country. But mainstream experts are deliberately ignoring the most fatal question. Why was the Iranian theocracy destroyed so easily? What exactly was this regime? The answer isn't in the bombs falling from the sky. It's in the starving Iranian people on the ground. Since the massive nationwide protests last December, the US and Israel saw the truth. The regime was already dead from the inside. For decades, they monopolized the economy, crushed the people, and spent the nation's wealth on terrorists and nuclear weapons. They had zero legitimacy left. Welcome back. In this video, we deeply analyze how did this conflict erupt? Why was Iran trapped in a dead end with no reform possible? And what happens next? The source of this conflict was actually ignored by many. It started with the deadlock between the Biden administration and Trump's return to the White House. From 2021 to 2024, Biden tried a softer approach to revive the nuclear deal, but Khamenei mistook this compromise for weakness. He took an extreme hardline stance, refusing all concessions, demanding outrageous terms, and secretly pushing uranium enrichment underground. Then in 2024, Khamenei inexplicably provoked Israel. On April 13th, Iran launched hundreds of drones and missiles at Israel from its own soil, as well as from Iraq and Yemen. Almost all were intercepted by the US and Israel. The damage was practically zero. Iran tried to look strong, but instead, they exposed their complete weakness. They showed the US and Israel just how fragile their true military power was. This laid the groundwork for the 12-day war. In June 2025, Israel decided Iran's nuclear program was crossing a red line. Because low-level conflicts couldn't stop Iran, Israel launched a massive airstrike on June 9th, destroying missile bases, killing IRGC commanders, and eliminating top nuclear scientists. Then the US stepped in, sending B-2 stealth bombers to heavily damage Iran's nuclear sites. Israel suffered zero casualties. Yet, astonishingly, Khamenei claimed Iran won the war against America. That 12-day conflict became the ultimate death warrant for Khamenei's regime. The war severely weakened Iran's military, but it dealt a fatal blow to its economy. Even after the fighting stopped, oil exports couldn't recover. The waters around Iran became extreme high-risk zones. Normally, tankers load oil at Iranian ports and sail directly to buyers. But post-conflict, insurance companies either refused coverage or demanded massive premiums. Foreign ships refused to dock. Iran's oil was completely trapped. To survive, Iran had to absorb all the risk using a ghost fleet. They loaded their own tankers, sailed them to safer waters near Singapore and the Malacca Strait, and just parked them. They waited for buyers to agree on a price, and only then would they finish the delivery. At one point, nearly 40 million barrels of Iranian oil were floating aimlessly at sea. This spiked transport costs, delayed payments, and utterly suffocated Iran's national cash flow. With foreign currency drying up, domestic industries faced immediate collapse. Aging equipment and an unstable power grid exposed the economy's fragility. By the summer of 2025, the government was forced to ration electricity to high-energy sectors like steel and petrochemicals. Production lines halted, industrial accidents multiplied, corporate costs skyrocketed, cash flows vanished, and the crisis spread. By the third quarter, massive waves of bankruptcies hit. Wages went unpaid, banks froze loans. The real economy entered a terminal state. But Khamenei ignored the starving public. He refused talks, refused to halt the nuclear program, and doubled down on anti-American propaganda. By early 2026, massive nationwide protests erupted again. The US and Israel openly called for the Iranian people to overthrow the regime. However, the US military had just finished an operation capturing Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Naval assets were tied up in the Caribbean. The US wasn't ready. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu convinced Trump to delay the strike. Launching a premature attack without clear goals could have been a disaster. A rush strike could have turned into a protracted war, just like Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It would have dragged the Middle East into long-term chaos. So Trump applied a different pressure tactic. He demanded Khamenei stop executing political protesters. In mid-January, Khamenei agreed to a pause, giving Trump a way out. Trump temporarily canceled the strike, but the U.S. immediately began surging forces into the Middle East. On January 26th, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group entered CENTCOM. America was preparing for war, while offering one last chance to talk. Look at how Trump handled Maduro. Apply maximum pressure, offer a peaceful exit, and if refused, execute the target. From August 2025, Trump tried to negotiate Maduro's surrender. Maduro refused, and the U.S. military surrounded him. Trump even gave Maduro one final phone call, offering amnesty if he fled. Maduro mocked him, danced on TV, and was subsequently captured. Khamenei replicated Maduro's fatal arrogance step by step. On February 6th, the U.S. and Iran held indirect talks in Oman. Trump sent his heavy hitters, envoys Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and crucially, CENTCOM Deputy Commander Vice Admiral Brad Cooper. Sending a top military general was a blatant threat. This wasn't diplomacy, it was an ultimatum. The U.S. demanded a permanent halt to uranium enrichment, missile caps, and an end to proxy funding. Yet, the Iranian delegation was incredibly stubborn. Not only did they refuse, they demanded all U.S. sanctions be lifted first. The first round failed, though Iran delusionally called it a good start. Following this, the U.S. deployed a second aircraft carrier to the region. The war machine was ready, but Khamenei, perhaps listening to bad advice, believed America was just bluffing. On February 17th, round 2 began in Geneva. Iran's foreign minister literally refused to even open the U.S. letter regarding ballistic missiles. That same day, Khamenei gave a fiery speech, calling U.S. demands foolish and threatening to sink American warships. He crossed the ultimate red line. On February 26th, the final round of talks in Geneva collapsed. Iran refused to yield. Talks were suspended for 4 hours, and the U.S. realized Iran would never compromise. Trump's patience was gone. He had already deployed hundreds of combat aircraft and anti-missile systems. Israel was locked and loaded. Trump planned to send the Secretary of State to Israel to coordinate the final strike. But suddenly, Israeli intelligence intercepted a golden opportunity. Khamenei was meeting top IRGC generals at his Tehran compound. Seizing this fleeting window, the U.S. and Israel immediately launched Operation Epic Fury. Multiple precision bunker busters slammed into the compound, completely collapsing the structures. Israeli intelligence confirmed Khamenei's body was found in the rubble. On the morning of March 1st, President Trump announced Khamenei's elimination to the world. Inside Iran, regime media panicked, trying to find proof he was alive. But a few hours later, state media officially confirmed his death. The remnants of the regime mourned, but the people celebrated. Immediately, regime loyalists claimed an internal mole leaked his location. It's a ridiculous excuse. The truth is, Khamenei and his inner circle were the biggest moles in their own country. They leached off the people, bankrupted the state, and blamed America for everything. A nation's true defense is the support of its people. If the regime represents the people will defend it. When Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, everyone thought Kyiv would fall in hours. But Zelensky stayed, and the citizens fought tooth and nail alongside the military. They repelled the Russian invasion. But Iran's regime was completely different. It was an occupying force in its own country. The Iranian theocracy had zero legitimacy. To understand why it fell so fast, we have to look at how this mafia state looted its own people. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrew the monarchy. Ayatollah Khamenei hijacked the revolution and established the theocracy. He created the title of Supreme Leader, holding absolute power over the government and the military. From day one, Khomeini used anti-Americanism as the sole justification for the regime's existence, brainwashing the public to ignore their internal rot. When Khomeini died in 1989, Ali Khamenei was not the natural successor. His religious rank was too low, but through a bureaucratic coup and by forging Khomeini's will, Khamenei was installed by a slim margin. He then changed the constitution to solidify his illegal power grab. Because he lacked true religious authority, he needed muscle. He founded in the IRGC. Khamenei expanded the Revolutionary Guards into a massive military force, making them the violent enforcers of his rule. Khamenei bought absolute loyalty by giving the IRGC and the clerics total control of Iran's economy. He used financial subsidies and monopolies to bind them to him. The IRGC created a massive corporate empire, swallowing oil, banking, and telecom sectors. Religious authority became just a decoration. The true power was the the IRGC's intelligence and suppression network. This unholy alliance destroyed any chance of reform. The civilian government, the parliament, and the president became powerless puppets. The Guardian Council vetted all political candidates. If anyone threatened the IRGC's profits, they were disqualified. The elections were totally rigged. Khamenei basically split Iran into two worlds, the inside for the regime elites and the outside for the impoverished masses. The elite looted the nation through three massive shadow organizations. First was Setad, originally meant to manage abandoned properties. It violently seized land from dissidents and minorities, building a $95 billion shadow treasury for the Supreme Leader. Private companies couldn't compete. Setad controlled the nation's core financial and energy sectors. Second was Qadam al-Anbiya, the IRGC's engineering arm. They monopolized all national infrastructure, from oil pipelines to telecommunications, operating as an untouchable state within a state. They even drafted their own sanctions list to block foreign imports, forcing Iranians to buy their inferior products at massive markups. Third were the bonyads, massive religious foundations. Supposedly charities, they actually controlled hundreds of subsidiaries, luxury hotels, and trading firms worth over $100 billion. They answered only to the IRGC and never accepted government audits. Economists estimate this syndicate controlled up to 60% of Iran's entire economy. And the craziest part, they were completely tax exempt. With 60% of the wealth shielded from taxes, the civilian government was permanently bankrupt. They had to aggressively tax the poor and endlessly print money. This wasn't a modern economy, it was a medieval feudal system. The elites acted like warlords. And what did they do with this stolen wealth? They funded foreign wars. They poured billions into the axis of resistance to export their revolution. Any attempt at reform by moderate presidents in the late 90s or 2000s was violently crushed by the deep state. The regime only cared about survival. The regime's anti-American rhetoric was just a psychological weapon to distract the Iranian people from their own suffering. But this foreign policy turned Iran into a pariah. They bled their treasury to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. The regime's hostility terrified neighboring Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, pushing them to secretly align with Israel to counter Iran. In Syria alone, Iran spent up to $50 billion propping up the Assad regime. They spent $1 billion a year on Iraqi militias. While Iranians starved, their wealth was used to turn neighboring nations to ashes. Khamenei's obsession with nuclear weapons triggered devastating global sanctions. In 2012, Iran was kicked out of the SWIFT banking system. When Trump exited the nuclear deal in 2018, oil exports crashed. The currency collapsed. The economy was pushed to the absolute brink. Between 2016 and 2024, the government printed money like crazy. The currency supply exploded, triggering apocalyptic hyperinflation. 10 years ago, $1 bought 30,000 rials. By early 2026, it took 1.5 million rials to buy a single US dollar. Life savings became worthless paper. Food prices surged 72%. Medical costs jumped 70%. Medicine ran out. Poor families were forced to sign do not resuscitate orders because they couldn't afford care. The crisis reached the dinner table. Chicken, the staple protein for the Iranian working class, saw its price surge by 200%. People couldn't afford chicken anymore. They were forced to eat eggplant, grimly calling it the poor man's chicken. Over 40% of the population fell below the absolute poverty line. How did the government respond? They ordered state TV to ban all footage of people eating chicken, terrified it would spark a revolution. They tried to hide reality. In December 2025, the largest protest since 1979 exploded. Millions marched chanting, "Death to the dictator." Khamenei didn't hesitate. He ordered a massive bloody crackdown, branding protesters as enemies of God. Under a total internet blackout, the IRGC slaughtered an estimated 12,000 civilians. They even extorted grieving parents to lie about how their children died on national TV. But the bloodshed couldn't save them. In February 2026, the US and Israel delivered the final blow. Khamenei was gone. The regime is now fracturing. Hardliner Ali Larijani formed a transitional council, but real power is being fought over by surviving IRGC warlords. Kurdish separatists are already seizing the chaos to declare independence. The power vacuum is terrifying. We are witnessing the collapse of the global authoritarian axis. Russia is bleeding in Ukraine, Assad is crumbling in Syria, Hamas and the Houthis are decimated, Maduro is in jail. The geopolitical lesson is absolute. A regime that hollows out its own nation and colonizes its own people is doomed to self-destruct. Khamenei didn't just just die from an airstrike. He died because his own parasitic theocracy destroyed the Iranian state.